Egyptologist. That is how you are described, right? What does
Yes.
it mean? Explain. Can you explain that, please?
Sure. So Egyptology is the ancient culture of the Nile Valley in what is today Egypt. So Kemet, of course, as you mentioned, is one of the ancient Egyptian words for that northern Nile Valley area. Um, Egyptology today, it can involve archaeology, it can involve studying art, like the art in temples and tombs, for instance, or statues. It involves language. There are many different phases of the ancient language in Kemet because that culture lasted for so long. And so language evolves over time. There are different language phases, there are different scripts that the language is written in, where most of us are familiar with hieroglyphs, and that's one way to write the ancient language, but there were others as well. So Egyptology can be archaeology, it can be art and art history, it can be history, it can be language study. All of those together make up the field of Egyptology, but typically Egyptologists will specialize in one or two of those areas.
Mhm. All right. As an Egyptologist, what do you do? How does somebody describe your kind of work? Yeah, how do you gather the information? How do you actually, in your day-to-day work, take us through that because many of us do not even understand how that works.
Sure. So some Egyptologists will have to go to Egypt to do their work. So for instance, if you're an archaeologist, you have to have a site that you're excavating. And so you go there and you do the work on the site. People who are focusing more on art history or history may go to museums to look at, for instance, the art in a museum collection and do their research in that way. They may look at ancient texts, um, books in a library, for instance. There are quite a lot of texts in museum collections as well. So that's another way to study ancient texts.
All right. Now, a curiosity, a very strange feeling that I was having, though. What does the discipline need to exist at all? Egyptology. What is the essence of its existence?
That's a good question. So this is important for those of us who want to understand human heritage. We look at ancient human cultures to understand how those ancient cultures were organized, how people lived. And this is important all over the world, not just in Egypt, to understand human origins. So Egyptology is one of many disciplines that looks at ancient humans, and it's important for us as humans to have these fields so that we understand our human trajectory across time. So I should mention there's a sort of allied discipline to Egyptology, which is called Nubiology. And it has very much the same sort of sub-disciplines as Egyptology. So archaeology, art history, history, language. But this focuses on the southern Nile Valley. So today, what is southern Egypt and Sudan. And so Egyptology and Nubiology together are very powerful because then you're looking at the Nile Valley as a whole, and more Egyptologists and Nubiologists are in conversation with one another and are sharing information. There's a lot more work being done in Nubiology today than there was 50 years ago. So this is very exciting because we're not getting just a snapshot picture of what was happening in the northern Nile Valley. We're getting a fuller picture of what was happening along the Nile Valley. And then, and this is even, I would say, a newer phenomenon, we're getting some scholars who are able to make connections between these ancient cultures of the Nile Valley and other cultures in Africa. And this is an area that has been very understudied until recently. And so I'll just give you a couple names of people who are doing this work right now. My colleagues Salim Faraji and Anissa Malvoisin. There are also some linguists who are doing work sort of connecting languages within the Nile Valley and elsewhere in Africa. And those are people like Andrew Jaggs and Sandro Capocicci and Chris Arrett. And there's work being done by biological anthropologists who are looking at ancient human remains from various places in Africa and making connections. And so a big person who does that work is Professor Keita, S-O-Y Keita, Kamani Nahusi, and also, I know on your podcast you spoke with Taharka Ade, who he's sort of making connections between Africa and African American culture in the US. So there's a lot of work being done outside of the discipline of Egyptology that's connecting with Egyptology. And this is where I think the field is going in the future. This is what is critically important, is to sort of break down these disciplinary boundaries that the university has set up and to have these conversations to show the interconnectedness of ancient humans in Africa, and then to show cultural connections in the modern day within Africa and in the diaspora as well.
That's very interesting. All right. Now, the study of Egypt or ancient Kemet, as we understand it, and the study of Nubia, are we actually looking at two different things here, so that we have Egyptologists and Nubiologists? I'm trying to understand what is actually the difference between the two.
The main difference is that Egyptologists work in the northern Nile Valley and Nubiologists work in the southern Nile Valley. So for those who aren't familiar with the word Nubia, Nubia refers to the area that is today southern Egypt and probably about the northern half of Sudan along the Nile Valley. So Nubiologists refer to people who study Nubia. So yeah, it's basically just a matter of geography. That's the key difference there.
Which, if by extension, if we were to actually put a ruler there, they are just neighbors, no?
Yes, that's right.
So which by extension can actually mean we are talking about the same culture. Is it possible?
Well, let's say the same groups of cultures, because it's such a very large geographic area. I wouldn't say there was one culture along that whole area. There's so many different settlements. And we're talking about such a long period of time for these ancient cultures that they existed. I mean, thousands of years. So I would say it's many cultures across a large geographic area, across a huge time span, but all in this Nile Valley. And so all sort of connected in that way, both literally by river travel, but also just in having contact, sharing a geographic zone with one another.
I'm trying to think now. Somebody will say is study the Romans, no? At least you can go as far as the whole of the Roman world. No, you can be talking about, because Roman also extend to UK, they extend to part of the Middle East, and is it Germany you want to be? Is at the end of the day, you are probably going to be talking about the same, if you are looking at Roma as a people, as a group of people, because they live for several years done together, so they manage to form their own culture, their own writing, their own way of life. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are referring to Rome or Italy, no? Is it possible that in that sense we can be looking at a group of people, when we are looking at Egypt, Nubia, the geography that we are looking at here, we can actually be looking at a people that have been mixing up among themselves? Is it possible like that, or is it that Egypt is completely different from Nubia? That is what I want you to clarify.
I would not say that Egypt is completely different from Nubia. There are differences, of course, but there are similarities, and it's very clear that those ancient cultures had contact with one another, that people from Nubia were living in Egypt and vice versa. People from Egypt were living in Nubia, and they were sharing cultural traditions in the way that people do when they come into contact with one another. They were certainly intermarrying with one another. And I should say also that this, in my opinion, this likely extended further south and also further to the west. But we have less evidence from those areas, so it's very difficult for us to sort of pinpoint this and to point to evidence We don't have that evidence because these areas are understudied with regard to antiquity. But it makes sense to me that these cultural connections, these connections between people, would have continued further south in Africa, further to the west in Africa. And we get hints of this, I should say, in Egyptian texts. So we do know that the Egyptians traveled south. Like, one of the lands they mention, which is far further south than Nubia, and perhaps maybe on the East Coast, we're not exactly sure where this land was, but it was called the land of Punt. And we know that the Egyptians would mount expeditions and go to Punt and trade with the people there and bring back goods from that area. We know that Egyptian officials traveled to places that seem to be to the south and west of Egypt, and we're not sure exactly what these places are. Like, we haven't been able to correlate the ancient geographic name with a modern place name, but we can tell just from the text and the way they talk about it that it does seem to be south into the west. So here I'm thinking of a particular official named Harkuf. So we get hints that these connections were happening further afield than only between Egypt and Nubia, but we don't have as much hard evidence as we would like, other than these ancient texts that talk about it, but they don't give us, obviously, modern place names to help us understand exactly where they're talking about.
And that is very interesting. And of course, they're not going to make mention of Nigeria or Ghana because these are a modern name, no?